Next, Spectator columnist Douglas Murray has written this week about his conflicted thoughts over the Iraq War. Many now see the invasion as a grave mistake, but for others, it's not that straightforward. He joins me now. Douglas, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You have written your column this week on your views about the Iraq War, and I should say conflicting views. You felt around the 20th anniversary back in March that you weren't quite sure what to say about it, but something else has happened recently that has prompted you to write about it this week. Tell us what that is.
Yes, that's the very sad death of the former Labour MP Ann Clwyd. Ann Clwyd left the House of Commons a number of years ago, but she was an extraordinarily long-serving and devoted Labour MP. She was one of, I think it's right to say, one of the sort of slightly awkward squad that all parties have. You don't fit into any particularly clear clique, and therefore don't always rise as high up on the greasy pole as perhaps they should. But Ann Clwyd was a really remarkable woman, and not only represented her constituents with great aplomb, but was also perhaps most famous in recent years for her internationalism. And specifically, and it's what brings me to write about the Second Iraq War, her devotion to the cause of the Kurdish people of northern Iraq. Ann Clwyd travelled to the area after the Anfal campaign in 1988, when Saddam Hussein tried to ethnically cleanse the Kurdish people in the north of his country. And she saw firsthand the brutality of that regime and campaigned for decades, not just for democratic rights in Iraq for all Iraqi people, but specifically also to indict Saddam Hussein for his war crimes against his own people in Iraq. And that didn't have any success, as it were, until 2003, when people listened to the case she made in great silence. I remember in the House of Commons, when in 2003 she explained what the horrors were of the Saddam Hussein regime. And that's what brought me to write about this terrible subject again, which was just that the complexity of it at a time when I think some people from all sides talk about the subject of Iraq, the very painful subject of Iraq, with a sort of degree of simplicity, which I think isn't quite what it warrants.
And Douglas, this hasn't been and still isn't really a left-right political issue, is it? As exemplified by the fact that you and Ann Clwyd had very similar views on the war.
No, that's right. I mean, as it happened, we became friendly and traveled to Iraq together because we shared the same view, which was that the Saddam Hussein regime was guilty of some of the most terrible crimes against its own people and other nations, of course. Remember that Iraq had been involved in a long, bloody war with Iran in the 1980s, it invaded Kuwait, and that it was an incredibly unstable as well as dangerous regime. Ann Clwyd's work included the documenting of the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that Saddam Hussein had perpetrated. And many people of left and right felt the same way. Some of her obituary notices have noted the fact that she, I think, erroneously have said she became friendly with Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld. It's not quite true. She met Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz in Washington, certainly. And they and others were interested in this and had been beforehand. Nowadays, there's a sort of again, there's a sort of left-right thing that people pretend about this as on all other issues. But there were people from across the political spectrum in those days who were equally concerned about what it meant for the international order to have a regime getting away with crimes of the kind that Saddam Hussein's regime did. And there was a sort of unity in those days. I mentioned in my piece that on one occasion, Ann Clwyd and I were visiting a Kurdish rights center in northern Iraq, and I was at least quite amused by the fact that the framed photos going all the way through the hallway and up the stairs were of people like Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, then of the Defense Policy Board, people who back home in America, in Britain, were all viewed with incredible disdain and disgust by that point, but who in this section of Iraq were regarded as heroes because they had argued the case of the Kurdish people, among other things, and their liberation from the tyranny of the Saddam Hussein regime. And as I mentioned, it's just one of those sort of reminders that, history is so much more complex when you're going through it than when you look back with all of the benefits of hindsight.
Douglas, you say in your column that those who opposed the Iraq War 20 years ago are not short of examples of how badly it was botched by countries like the U.S. But you say that your views have never been so black and white, and even to this day, they aren't. And part of that is due to the experiences that you had with Ann in Iraq.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I was very struck that there was an enormous just polarism in those times. When people talk about things being polarized in our politics today, you should remember they were highly polarized 20 years ago as well. But I remember very, very, very struck by the fact that there wasn't very much new you could say about the Iraq War quite early on. Even before it began. One of the few things I remember noting somebody saying that I thought was striking was Ian McEwan, the novelist, who at one point, and I can't remember if it's in the novel Saturday or in one of his columns around the same time, but he noted that the anti-war protesters, if they'd have been aware of what they were marching for in totality, should have marched in silence. Now, why did he say that? Because although there was a very good reason to say don't go in at all, it would also, of course, mean the continuation of the Hussein family's tyranny over Iraq, including the inevitable succession of Uday and Qusay Hussein, when their father died. And I was very struck by that observation of McEwan's, and I've always thought at the time it was right. But you hold that view against intervention, but note that also has terrible, terrible consequences, not least for the Iraqi people. And it's just something I sort of say echo in my piece, which is I think everybody who supported the war, there were a lot more back then than perhaps admit it now. Everybody who supported the war has to take some responsibility, or at least culpability, for the terrible things that happened and the disaster of the implementation, the post-war period. And also, and I say it's and as well, recognize that it was not as completely black and white as some people would now paint it in retrospect. I mentioned the piece that it was on the first years after the Saddam Hussein regime had fallen, and Ann Clwyd and I were in the north, and were there when Nowruz, the Kurdish New Year, was being celebrated. This was a festival that had been stamped out throughout the Saddam Hussein years as he tried to rob the Kurdish people of their culture. And here they were able to celebrate it again and be free again for the first time in years. And so, rather like that point that McEwan made, I say that I simultaneously can think of the disaster of what happened across most of Iraq and the terrible implementation of post-war planning, and also the fact that in that corner of the country, at least, it is true that a freedom came which had not existed before. And I just sort of think that story can't be lost, and it's one I try to bring out.
Douglas, you had a similar conversation with Peter Hitchens and Fraser Nelson on a very old version of Spectator TV about 8 years ago. And I'm curious to what extent your views have changed since then. I totally take your point that it's never going to be black or white for you, but what do you wish you knew then that you know now?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think that everybody has to take into account the fact that the principal claim of the UK government about WMD turned out to be wrong. And now, again, it's one of those things that people say, well, we knew that to be wrong. But as Bruce Anderson and others have observed in past years, there's no particular shame in taking the word of your intelligence services and government for granted on occasion. And, of course, the fact that they were wrong on the WMD claim is one of the things that has caused so much greater skepticism, not just about intelligence claims, but about all claims by politicians in the 20 years since. I think there have been a lot of consequences from that, not least in America with the success of Donald Trump and others who say, you can't trust the institutions, and there's definitely something in that. It's had consequences like that. I think the other thing, and the thing that has been quietly discussed over the last 20 years, and it's probably too early still to discuss among those who were involved, but was exactly where and when the post-war period went so badly wrong. People forget that there was a period of months where Donald Rumsfeld was hailed as a military genius, even by his enemies. I think probably now the history says that he and some others who I knew took their eye off the ball, and I think that was certainly the case. It's I remember Germaine Greer saying at the time, and I remember I didn't entirely agree with it, but I thought it was very, very interesting point. I remember Germaine Greer saying the problem with war is you open Pandora's box and you just can't contain it. I absolutely see the wisdom of that observation of Germaine Greer's, and certainly I think others who were bullish about interventionism, then having seen what the surgeon was like, have certainly stepped back from supporting it again. In other words, if you can't do it well, don't do it at all. But at the same time, I think that there's an attraction that has come since Iraq to many people on the right and left of a sort of isolationism. And I, at any rate, still certainly don't share that. I don't think it's possible or desirable for a country like America or Britain to simply have a domestic policy and not have a foreign policy as well. I don't think it's desirable to believe, as many people do, particularly on the right in America now, that, as it were, we have no right to feel ourselves in any way able to act in the world. I don't accept that as being the case. I think that the cause of internationalism, the left-right internationalism of the kind that Ann Clwyd and others represented, has taken a serious battering of late. But I think that there is also a battering for being an isolationist as well. I think there is a battering for those people who believe that you can effectively let the world govern itself or police itself, or let the UN or other international bodies be the only arbiters. I think that view also takes quite a beating. So it's a constant ebb and flow. That I would say that people just have to be, and I'm certainly more aware myself of the difficulty of navigating between this Scylla and Charybdis.
Douglas, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV.